The great hall of Ironridge was full to its last inch of floor, and every eye in it had already found Evelyn Ashford. Not Alpha Rowan Blackthorne, standing on the dais with his chin set at the angle he saved for moments he wanted remembered. Not Lady Celine Voss, beside him in crimson silk that drank the chandelier light and gave it back gold. Not the trays of white roses lining every table, roses Evelyn had ordered herself 3 weeks earlier, after Rowan mentioned offhand that they were Celine's favourite, back when she still believed she was arranging her own night. Not the twin rows of Ironridge guards standing rigid along the walls, swords sheathed but hands never far from them. Not the gold Ironridge banners hung the full height of the walls. Not the musicians settling into place along the gallery rail. Not the hundreds of nobles and ranked wolves packed shoulder to shoulder from the dais to the doors. They were watching her. Ironridge hadn't held a lunar ceremony in nearly 20 years, and every person in that hall had come believing tonight would finally be the one. Evelyn felt their attention settle over her the way cold settles into a room before anyone notices the fire has gone out. Not sudden, just complete, arriving from every direction at once. 4 years in this pack had taught her every register of being looked at, and she knew this one on contact. It wasn't unkind. Most of these people liked her well enough, but liking her wasn't what tonight was for. They had come to watch something break, and they wanted a clear view when it did. She understood the expectation completely, because she had built it herself without meaning to. For 4 years, she had run Ironridge quietly from behind Rowan's shoulder. She was the one who had caught the treasury's shortfall before it became a famine 2 winters ago. The one who had talked 2 border villages out of a blood feud that would have cost Rowan half his warriors. The one every council member brought their real problems to, once Rowan had already lost interest and wandered off toward whatever tournament was starting next. The council trusted her judgment. The servants trusted her fairness. Even the warriors, who trusted little beyond a blade's edge, trusted that when Evelyn said a plan would hold, it held. She had never once asked Rowan for a title. She had simply assumed, the way everyone in this hall had assumed, that a title would eventually find her, the way morning eventually finds a window. Rowan raised his goblet, and the hall stilled on command. Ironridge deserves a future built on passion, he said, pitch to carry to the back doors. Not obligation. The musicians stopped mid-note. A side door opened, and Celine crossed the floor like she'd practiced the walk in a mirror, because she had. She had the look of a woman who'd already decided how this story ended, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Rowan met her halfway and settled a hand at her waist, and the whole room leaned forward, certain of the word they were about to hear. Celine will remain at my side, he said instead, as my companion. Not Luna, not his equal, not his mate. A woman lifted just high enough for the hall to notice, and no higher. A distinction every noble in the room understood immediately, even if Celine, glowing with the moment, did not yet seem to. The murmur that followed wasn't shock, it was pity. Already turning to see exactly how badly this would land on Evelyn, she smiled, but not the smile the room had been promised, not the brittle, brave kind arranged for an audience waiting to watch it crack. What crossed her face instead was smaller and far more dangerous. A smirk, there and gone inside a second, before she lowered her head toward the dais. I wish you both every happiness, Alpha. She meant it, and that seemed to trouble Rowan more than tears would have. He searched her face for the crack he'd been counting on, and didn't find one. Beside him, Celine's smile faltered for just a moment, sensing a joke she hadn't been let in on. Evelyn slipped out before the first dance began, before anyone could arrange their face into the sympathy they'd prepared for her. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button, and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. The palace gardens were empty and cold under a clean sky. Frost silvered the hedges, and somewhere past the wall, an owl called once and went still, as though even the garden understood it was witnessing something private. Out here, finally alone, she let the evening drop from her shoulders, like a coat she'd been holding shut by will alone. She drew back her collar. Beneath it, just under her left collarbone, a mark shaped like a silver wolf caught the moonlight and answered it, faint and steady. 6 months. It had rested there, hidden exactly where court fashion had always, conveniently, kept that stretch of skin covered. "Too late," she murmured, not bitter, almost fond, like the words were an old joke only she was in on. She hadn't lied to Rowan tonight. She did wish him happiness, the same distant way anyone might wish it, on someone who could no longer touch them. It was easy to be generous toward a man who had already lost the power to hurt you, and Rowan had lost his that same night, in a quiet library during the Royal Summit, though he still didn't know it, and wouldn't for months yet. Every person inside that hall believed tonight had decided something. Rowan believed he'd finally chosen. Celine believed she'd finally won. Even the servants whispering behind their hands believed they'd just watched Evelyn Ashford lose everything she'd spent 4 years building. None of them knew the choice had already been made, months ago, by someone with a far greater claim to her than an alpha who had never once asked what she actually wanted for herself. She hadn't spent tonight waiting to see if Rowan would choose her. She'd been waiting to see if anyone in Iron Ridge would notice they'd already lost her. And watching them look straight past the truth without finding it, she finally had her answer. She touched the mark once more before drawing her collar closed. For the first time all evening, she let herself remember the man who'd put it there, a pair of silver eyes that hadn't looked away from her once, and the words he'd said, instead of any of the ones she'd braced herself for. It had started at a summit, convened for treaties and taxation, the kind of gathering Rowan avoided, and Evelyn had only attended because someone from Iron Ridge had to. She hadn't expected it to be the night her whole life quietly changed direction. Somewhere beyond Iron Ridge's borders, in a hall grander than this one, someone was already deciding it was time to come and claim what he'd marked as his 6 months ago. 6 months before Rowan raised his goblet to the wrong woman, Evelyn Ashford had no interest in kings, courts, or the Royal Summit convened for treaties and taxation. It was the kind of gathering that mattered enormously to every alpha in the north, and interested Rowan not at all. She'd gone only because someone from Iron Ridge had to, and Rowan, who could stomach a battlefield far better than a treaty table, had made it clear that someone would not be him. She expected 3 days of tedious negotiation and forgettable faces. She packed accordingly, her ledgers, and not one gown meant to turn heads. Then she stepped into the Royal Library, and every plan she'd made for those 3 days stopped mattering. Across the room, near a window full of late afternoon light, stood a man she had never met, and somehow already knew. Tall. Still, in the way that only comes from real authority, the kind that never has to raise its voice to be obeyed. His eyes found hers and held there, silver, startling, entirely unmoving, and something old and wordless inside her sat up and paid attention for the first time in her life. Alpha King Lucian Valerius, the ruler every alpha in the north answered to, including Rowan, though Rowan preferred not to be reminded of it. He wore the crown the way some men wear an old scar, present but rarely mentioned, and nothing about the plain dark coat he'd chosen for a room full of treaty documents suggested someone who needed reminding of his own authority. Neither of them spoke. Neither, it seemed, needed to. Whatever had just recognized itself across that room didn't require an introduction, and for one long moment, Evelyn simply stood there, breathless in a way she had no polite word for. For a few absurd seconds, she tried to argue with it anyway. Wolves did not stop mid-thought over a stranger across a library, whatever the old stories claimed. Then he began walking toward her, unhurried and entirely certain, and every instinct she owned recognized him as something closer to home than Iron Ridge had ever managed to feel in 4 years. The argument she'd been building collapsed before she finished making it. Lucian crossed the library without hurry, and the handful of attendants along its walls found urgent business elsewhere before he'd said a word to any of them. "I've been searching for you," he said, "longer than I care to admit. You don't know me." It came out steadier than she felt. "I haven't felt quiet in here in longer than I can remember." He touched 2 fingers briefly to his own chest. "I have, since the moment you walked in. I already serve an alpha, Your Majesty. Iron Ridge. You serve him," Lucian agreed, something in his voice gentling without losing its certainty. "That isn't the same as belonging to him. I don't think it ever was." Somewhere in the back of her mind, distant and faintly hysterical, a voice pointed out that she was standing in a library, arguing philosophy with the most powerful man in the North, and that perhaps this was not the moment to also notice he had an unfairly nice voice. She ignored it. Mostly. He didn't press further. He didn't need to. The bond between them had already said what needed saying, in a language neither of them had chosen, and both of them recognized instantly. Over the hours that followed, while the summit's business carried on around them, Evelyn watched Lucien the way she had learned to watch every man who held power, for the gap between how he spoke to his equals and how he spoke to everyone beneath him. She never found one. He thanked the servant who refilled his cup by name. He heard out a minor steward's grain dispute for twice as long as protocol required, then settled it in a single sentence Rowan would never have thought to ask for. By the second day, she noticed something closer to recognition than observation. People looked at Lucien's crown, his silver eyes, the sheer weight of what he could do to them if displeased, and looked away again before they ever reached the man underneath. She knew that kind of invisibility from the inside. She had simply never expected to find it standing at the head of an empire. He remembered, without being told twice, that she took her tea without honey. That evening, under a sky gone fully dark, he led her to the moon shrine at the edge of the palace grounds, where a royal priestess waited without any visible surprise at all. The ceremony was brief, hushed, nothing like the banquet Ironridge would throw for Celine 6 months later. No crowd, no goblets, no announcement to a waiting hall, only moonlight, an old woman's steady voice confirming what both their wolves had already known since the library, and a mark blooming silver beneath Evelyn's collarbone, like something that had been waiting there all along for the right moment to surface. It didn't hurt the way she'd braced for. It felt instead like a held breath finally releasing, some tension she'd carried so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. Lucien could have claimed her publicly that same night. One word from him, and every alpha at the summit would have learned that Ironridge's overlooked administrator now outranked them all. Instead, he asked nothing of her. "You've spent years building another man's kingdom," he said, once the priestess had gone. "I won't ask you to walk away from that in a single night, just because I found you first. Leave when your heart has finished saying goodbye to him, not one day before. No command, no claim staked in front of witnesses, only patience, offered like something he trusted her enough to hand over, without conditions attached." It was the first time in Evelyn's life that someone with real power over her had treated her choices as though they mattered more than his own. She had spent 4 years learning that being needed and being chosen were not the same thing. Lucien, without seeming to try very hard at all, had just shown her the difference. So she went back to Ironridge. Not for Rowan. She understood herself too well for that. She went back because she needed to know something the mark alone couldn't tell her. Whether the man she'd spent 4 years protecting had ever valued her for herself, or only for the kingdom she kept from falling apart in his hands. Rowan would spend the next 6 months exactly as she expected. Restless, easily distracted, endlessly certain that whatever Ironridge needed, he'd get around to noticing eventually. The memory let her go slowly, the way it always did, setting her back down in the cold of the palace garden. 6 months and one humiliating banquet later, she let her collar fall back into place and turned toward a party that no longer had anything to do with her. She had come home for an answer. Tonight, standing in a hall full of roses she'd chosen for another woman's victory, she'd finally gotten it. What Ironridge hadn't gotten yet was the bill. 3 weeks after the banquet, Evelyn had learned to recognize the sound of a council meeting sliding sideways before anyone else in the room noticed it happening. Celine had joined the council the week after Rowan's announcement, which meant she was now 2 weeks into a job no one had properly explained to her, eager and unprepared in roughly equal measure. Rowan himself rarely sat through a full session anymore. Tournaments and border patrols suited him better than ledgers, and he trusted the table to run itself the way it always had, without noticing that the reason it always had was no longer sitting at it the same way. Celine took Evelyn's old seat near the head of the table, in a room that still smelled faintly of the banquet's flowers, and nodded along to reports she plainly didn't follow. "The Millhaven contract only needs your signature," the treasurer said that morning, sliding a parchment across the table toward her. She'd been handed the trade portfolio because Rowan thought it sounded suitably important, without asking anyone whether it was. Celine glanced at it, then set it aside for something she found more interesting. "I'll look at it this week." She had said the same thing the week before, about a different contract. 3 merchant houses were now quietly wondering whether Iron Ridge still wanted their business at all. Evelyn said nothing. A season ago she would have signed it herself, caught the tariff clause Celine hadn't noticed, and had it on a rider's saddle before lunch. Instead, she kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the old treasurer's face fall by careful degrees. The granary problem surfaced 2 days later, when the miller himself arrived asking which of his own numbers Iron Ridge intended to believe. The count he'd submitted, or the different one already logged before his cart had even reached the gate. "I only have the one set of scales," he said, baffled. "I don't know how you've got 2. No one could tell him. Celine suggested, brightly, that he simply resubmit both and let the council choose. The miller left more confused than he'd arrived. That was the shape of the last 3 weeks. Nothing catastrophic yet. Nothing anyone could point to and call a crisis. Just 100 small threads, each one Evelyn used to catch before it frayed, now left to fray on their own. A border rider's report on cattle raids near the eastern hills sat unread on a desk for 6 days before anyone remembered it existed. The servant who left was Marta, who had run the East Wing for 11 years and knew which floorboards creaked before any wolf's ears could tell her. She came to Evelyn's study the night before she went, not to complain, only to say she was tired of asking Celine the same question 3 times and getting 3 different answers each time. Evelyn thanked her for 11 years of work no one above stairs had ever properly thanked her for, and didn't ask her to stay. It wasn't her place to ask anymore, and some part of her suspected Marta already understood exactly why. The council, Evelyn noticed, had stopped bringing their real concerns to the table at all, without anyone ever announcing it. They brought them to her office instead, in low voices, as though the council chamber had quietly stopped being useful for anything but appearances. She found Rowan in the training yard, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, sword arcing through a drill he'd run 1,000 times without breaking rhythm to answer her. 2 granaries, 2 different numbers, she said. That isn't inexperience, Rowan. That's someone not checking her own work. Iron Ridge has survived worse than a slow month. It isn't a slow month. It's the same 3 problems wearing different faces. Celine's still learning the shape of things. He finally stopped and looked at her, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. Give her the season. The season was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. She didn't argue further. Arguing had never been the plan. She had gone to the summit and come home to learn something true about Rowan, and she was learning it in installments, each one small enough to forgive on its own, and damning only once you added them together. So she stopped catching things before they fell, not out of spite. She was careful with herself about that distinction, turning it over more than once to be sure it held. More than one evening, her hand found a quill and half a solution before she remembered why she'd set both back down. When the border rider's report finally surfaced, 6 days late, and it turned out 3 families near the eastern hills had gone that long without a promised grain delivery, she sent the grain herself, without a word to anyone, through a steward who knew better than to ask questions. Hunger was not a lesson she was willing to let anyone learn on her behalf. Pride, she'd decided, was a different matter. Pride could go a little hungry and survive it. Everything smaller than that, she let stand. In the evenings, alone in the small study that had once been the busiest room in the pack, she wrote it down. The Millhaven contract. The granary discrepancy. The date the border report arrived, and the date it should have. Not to build a case for revenge. Revenge had never interested her. She wrote it down because someone, eventually, was going to ask how Iron Ridge had gotten here, and she intended for the answer to exist somewhere other than her own memory. Autumn had turned properly cold in the last week, the kind that crept in under doors no matter how well they were sealed, and she'd long since stopped expecting anyone to knock this late. She was closing that ledger one such evening, the candle burned down to its last inch, when a soft weight landed on the study windowsill instead. A hawk, hooded in grey, a small sealed letter, bound above its leg, with a ribbon, the color of a northern winter sky. She hadn't heard a single word from him since the night at the moon shrine. Not a letter, not a messenger, not so much as a rumor carried by a passing rider. 6 months of silence she had understood, even respected, because he had told her plainly he intended to keep it. Evelyn crossed the room slowly and unlatched the window. The hawk stepped onto her offered wrist without hesitation, as though it had done this before, somewhere she hadn't yet been. She turned the letter over. The seal pressed into the wax was a wolf, small and exact, the same shape that had been resting beneath her collarbone for 6 months and 3 weeks now. She hadn't told him where to find her. She broke the seal anyway. The letter was 4 lines long, and none of them asked when she was coming home. She read it standing at the window, the hawk still settling on the sill beside her, before she let herself sit down properly to take it in. Did you remember to eat today? Or is that still a habit you're neglecting? The roses outside the East Tower bloomed white this year. No one predicted that. The head gardener owes someone a great deal of coin. I've had the kitchen stop sending honey with my tea. Habit, I suppose. It seemed like one worth breaking. No mention of the mark. No mention of the 6 months, or when she might finally come home to him. Just a king finding the time, between treaties he hadn't asked for, and wars he hadn't started, to notice whether she'd eaten, and to quietly change a habit of his own, because he remembered a small thing about her that she hadn't realized she'd let show. She told herself, the first time she wrote back, that she was only being courteous. A king who'd sealed a bond with her deserved at least a reply. She kept it to 3 careful sentences about the weather and the grain harvest, nothing that could be mistaken for warmth. His answer thanked her for the weather report with such open amusement that she caught herself smiling at a piece of paper, alone, at midnight, and had to sit with that a moment before she let herself enjoy it. No one in Ironridge knew the hawks came for her. She kept them the same way she kept the ledger, to herself, with no plans to explain either one until she was ready to. By the 3rd letter, the tone had shifted, just slightly. Less report, more thought. I keep wondering what you'd make of the treaty debates here. You'd have settled the tariff dispute in an afternoon. It took my counsel 11 days and a great deal of wasted parchment. He recommended a history of the old northern treaties next, on the grounds that she'd secretly enjoy something so dry, and he was right, which annoyed her more than she let the letter know. By the 4th or 5th exchange, her own replies had grown a little less careful. She mentioned, without quite meaning to, that she used to love this season before it became the season. Everything in Ironridge seemed to break. He didn't offer sympathy. He only asked what exactly she used to love about it, as though the answer mattered to him more than the complaint did. She stopped counting days. She still hadn't decided when to leave, but the letters had, without her quite noticing when, stopped being a reason to stay and started being the reason the waiting no longer felt like waiting at all. She caught herself, more than once, glancing toward the window before there was any real reason to expect a hawk at all. It took her longer than she'd like to admit to recognize the feeling as something as ordinary as looking forward to something, a feeling she hadn't let herself have in longer than she could remember. Rowan, meanwhile, had run out of patience for a kingdom that no longer ran the way it used to. A shipment of winter cloth arrived at the wrong garrison entirely, 3 days before the season's first real frost, and sat there a week because no one thought to ask who it belonged to. A tax dispute between 2 guild halls escalated into a shouting match in the open market, the kind of public embarrassment Ironridge hadn't seen in years. I don't understand how this keeps happening, he said more than once, to no one at all. It wasn't that he didn't care. He cared enormously, in the loud, easily distracted way he cared about most things, fiercely for an afternoon, then on to whatever fire needed him next. Celine got the same fierce, temporary devotion the kingdom itself once had, and, like the kingdom, mistook it for something steadier than it was. She wasn't cruel, not yet. Mostly she seemed tired, and a little frightened, the way anyone might be after being placed somewhere they weren't trained for, and were too proud to admit it. More than once, Evelyn heard her describe one of Evelyn's own quiet corrections, as though she'd thought of it herself. Evelyn let her have it. Credit, unlike hunger, cost nothing to give away. Once, in a corridor between meetings, Celine asked her outright how she managed to stay so composed, while everything around them seemed to be falling apart. Evelyn only said she'd learned patience a long time ago, and left it there, watching Celine turn the non-answer over, without finding anything solid enough to grab onto. It was Rowan who finally came to Evelyn's study, the same study the Hawks had learned to find, and asked, without quite meeting her eyes, whether she'd consider training Celine properly. He said it the way men say things they've rehearsed and still don't quite believe. "She listens to you," he said, which wasn't true and hadn't been in weeks, though Evelyn understood the sentence he actually meant. "I don't know how to fix this, and I'm too proud to say so plainly." "Of course, Alpha." She didn't smirk this time. What crossed her face was quieter than that. The expression of a woman who'd just been handed an official reason to keep watching exactly what she'd already spent a month documenting anyway. Celine, watching from across the room, mistook it for relief. She was, as usual lately, only half right. Training Celine turned out to be less like teaching and more like watching a house being built in reverse. They met most mornings in the same small study the Hawks had learned to find, ledgers spread across the same table, where Evelyn had once worked alone. "You don't need to memorize the tariff schedule," Evelyn told her the first week, laying a ledger open between them. "You need to know it's there, and who to ask when the numbers look wrong." Celine wasn't looking at the ledger. "How did you get the council to stop whispering when you walk in?" "I signed things correctly." "That's not what I meant." It was, in fact, exactly what Evelyn meant, and exactly the answer Celine had no interest in hearing. Over the following weeks, the pattern held. Celine wanted the posture of competence, the right pause before speaking, the right tilt of the chin, and almost no appetite for the unglamorous work underneath it. She asked how to seem certain, far more often than she asked how to be right. She interrupted the eldest of the council twice in one meeting. The second time, he was explaining why the Eastern Patrol route needed to shift before the ground froze. The same shift Evelyn had ordered 2 winters running, and Celine cut him off to suggest leaving it as it was, since changing it now would unsettle the men before winter. The old captain looked to Rowan, waiting for someone to overrule her. No one did. 3 weeks later, an early freeze caught 2 patrols still walking the old route, unprepared for the terrain. No one was hurt. It was close enough that the captain stopped bringing his concerns to council at all, and started bringing them to Evelyn's study instead, the way everyone else already had. Once, briefly, something honest slipped through the performance. "They don't look at me the way they looked at you," Celine said, not quite meaning to say it aloud, and covered the admission so quickly. Evelyn almost believed she'd imagined it. Evelyn didn't tell her it got easier. In her experience, it mostly just got quieter. The worst of it came during a session on the spring shipping routes, when Celine presented a fix for the Millhaven contract's stalled terms. The exact fix Evelyn had walked her through in private 3 days earlier, word for word. Rowan lit up. "This is what I meant," he told the table, delighted. "When I said she only needed time, he meant it as praise for Celine." Evelyn heard it for what it actually was, an accidental verdict on 4 years of her own work, delivered by a man who still didn't know whose idea he was applauding. Some part of him had to know. He simply couldn't afford, having declared her worthy of the hall's applause, to be seen changing his mind in front of it now. The old treasurer found Evelyn afterward, in the corridor, without preamble. "It isn't the same," he said, "since you stepped back." "I haven't gone anywhere." "No," he agreed. "But you've stopped being useful in the way we needed, and started being useful in a way none of us asked for." She turned his words over more than once in the weeks that followed. He wasn't wrong, and he wasn't entirely right either. What Ironridge missed wasn't her hand on every problem. It was the certainty that someone was watching closely enough to catch the ones that mattered. Celine watched for admiration. Evelyn had always watched for consequences. It was, she was beginning to understand, the entire difference between them, and probably the only one that mattered. By the 10th week, the whispers had travelled further than Ironridge's walls. A trader passing through mentioned, without meaning any harm by it, that neighbouring packs had begun asking pointed questions about whether Ironridge's council could still be trusted to honour its agreements. One had already sent a rider to quietly ask whether the grain agreement still stood, worded carefully enough to be denied later if needed. Rowan dismissed all of it as gossip. Evelyn wrote it down anyway, in the same drawer as everything else. Iron Ridge's name, once spoken with something close to respect, was starting to be spoken the way people speak about a bridge they're no longer certain will hold their weight. She was in the training yard with Celine, 3 months to the day since the banquet, when the horn sounded at the gate. Not a merchant's horn, not a border rider's. A single golden note, high and deliberate, the kind reserved for exactly one rider in the entire north. Every hand in the yard stilled. Every head turned at once. Celine's hand went to her collar, smoothing something that didn't need smoothing. Rowan came out of the practice ring at a dead run, already composing his welcome. Evelyn didn't move at all. He would spend the next several minutes being welcoming. She intended to spend them finding out what, after 3 months of nothing but hawks arriving quietly at midnight, was important enough to send a rider through the front gate in daylight. Through it rode a single messenger in the king's colors, dust rising behind him in a thin gold line, visible from the far end of the yard. A sealed scroll held before him like something sacred. The wax pressed with a wolf she would have recognized blind. The messenger didn't dismount. Dust was still settling around his horse's hooves when he broke the seal and read it to the yard in a voice trained to carry. By decree of Alpha King Lucian Valerius, Iron Ridge is named a stop upon this season's royal progress. His Majesty will arrive within the fortnight. His stay is expected to extend well beyond the customary 2 nights. A murmur went through the yard immediately. This was not the courtesy visit any of them had been trained to expect. Kings passed through vassal packs. They did not linger in them. Rowan repeated the line to himself twice, visibly recalculating his own importance in real time. "The king means to make an example of us," he said, already turning toward the hall, already composing the speech he'd give at the gates. "Every road repaired, every banner replaced. I want this yard cleared of anything that isn't gleaming by the time he rides through it." Celine had gone very still beside him, her eyes bright with a different arithmetic entirely. She'd spent 3 months learning to fake competence for a hall full of people who already knew her. A king who'd never seen her at all felt like a chance to simply start over. She was asking a servant about seamstresses before the messenger had finished re-rolling his scroll, and spent an evening that week practicing one exact tilt of her chin in a hand mirror, the one she'd seen queens use in old paintings, until her maid gently suggested she might also want to sleep. Even the villagers beyond the walls had heard by the second day, word traveling the way it always did, faster than any decree could officially arrive. Evelyn stood very still through all of it, hands folded the way they always were, giving nothing away. Only Evelyn understood what an unusually long stay actually meant. That evening, a second message arrived, smaller and unofficial, delivered the way it always was, by wing beat rather than hoof beat. One line. "This time, I'm not writing to ask. I'm coming to bring you home." She read it 3 times before she let herself set it down. The preparations swallowed the days that followed whole. Roads were repaired that hadn't needed repairing in a decade. Statues were scrubbed until they gleamed. The great hall itself was stripped of its banquet flowers and refitted with heavier gold, as though the building understood this visit called for something sturdier than roses. Rowan drilled his warriors until they could hold formation half asleep, and Celine commissioned 3 gowns from a seamstress who'd never been asked to work so fast in her life. Somewhere in the middle of it, Rowan went looking for the old ceremonial itinerary from the last time a king had visited Iron Ridge at all, and pulled the wrong ledger from the archive by mistake. It had been shelved wrong for years, wedged behind newer records no one had reason to move. He might never have found it if he hadn't been looking for something else entirely. It was Evelyn's handwriting that stopped him. 4 years of it, filling page after page in the same careful hand. One entry, a little over 2 years back, recorded a grain shortfall severe enough that 3 villages should have gone hungry that winter. Beside it, in Evelyn's hand, resolved via early purchase from Thornwood stores, before the shortfall became public. He remembered that winter. He remembered congratulating himself, at the time, for allying with such a well-stocked pack. He hadn't chosen anything, she had simply made sure he never needed to. He turned another page, then another. It didn't get better. He sat with that ledger longer than he meant to. None of the polished roads or scrubbed statues, he was beginning to suspect without quite admitting it, would matter nearly as much as he needed them to. He was quieter during the drills that followed, distracted in a way his warriors noticed, but didn't dare comment on. More than once, an order came out half-finished, his attention drifting back to a column of careful handwriting only he had seen. "The Thornwood Purchase," he said to her, a morning or two later, without preamble, the ledger still under his arm. "2 winters back. That was you." It wasn't a question. It was a Tuesday, Evelyn said, and someone needed to be. Rowan opened his mouth, then closed it again, visibly recalculating something he didn't yet have words for. It was, if she was honest, the first genuinely uncertain silence she'd seen from him in months. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask her to, but he didn't put the ledger away either. For the first time in 4 years, Rowan Blackthorne had begun wondering what, exactly, he had built with his own 2 hands, and how much of it had only ever been hers. He didn't like the answer that was forming. Evelyn had stopped believing this was politics somewhere around the 3rd reading of Lucian's letter. Iron Ridge was polishing statues and rehearsing bows for a king, with no intention of inspecting a kingdom at all. He was coming to collect a promise 6 months old, and in all that time, he had never once given her reason to think he wouldn't keep it. The king arrived on a bright, cold morning, 12 days after his messenger had, and every soul in Iron Ridge who could stand upright had gathered outside the gates to watch. Silver banners lined the road, unfamiliar and dazzling against roads that had never seen anything grander than a trade caravan. Royal guards came first, 2 by 2, armor catching the morning light. Behind the carriage came a retinue longer than Iron Ridge's entire standing guard, banners and horses stretching back around the bend until the end of the procession was still arriving as the front of it reached the gates. The carriage itself was pulled not by horses, but by a pair of dire wolves, the size of small horses themselves, white as fresh snow, moving with a discipline no ordinary animal could manage. Somewhere in the crowd, a child asked loudly why the wolves were bigger than the horses, and was hurriedly hushed. Then, finally, Lucian. He stepped down tall and composed, wrapped in white fur trimmed with gold, that caught the light the way nothing in Iron Ridge's own treasury ever had. The entire crowd dropped to their knees at once, a single motion, like wind moving through a field. Rowan had practiced his welcome in front of a mirror, 3 separate mornings, adjusting the exact weight he gave the word majesty each time, certain this moment would be remembered for years. He stepped forward, dressed in his finest. "Your Majesty, Iron Ridge welcomes." Lucian walked past him, not slowly, not deliberately, in the way that might have let Rowan pretend he'd simply misjudged the timing. He simply continued walking, as though Rowan were a column standing in his path, rather than the alpha of the pack he'd come to visit, his silver eyes already moving past the kneeling nobles, searching the crowd for someone he clearly already knew was there. Rowan's hand, still raised in the gesture meant to accompany his welcome, hung uselessly in the air for a moment, before he remembered to lower it. Lucian found her standing quietly near the back of the council, exactly where she always stood, the corners of her mouth lifted, faint and familiar, the same quiet smirk that had once confused an entire hall, the night everyone in it expected her to break. This time, Lucian smiled back. He crossed the remaining distance without a single glance at anyone else in the yard, took her hand, and pressed his lips to it in front of every noble, servant, and warrior Iron Ridge possessed. Beneath her collar, the mark she'd carried hidden for the better part of a year warmed against her skin, as if it too had simply been waiting for permission to stop pretending it was nothing at all. "Evelyn," he said, her name alone in his mouth, sounding like something rehearsed 1,000 times, and meant every single one of them. "Have I kept you waiting too long?" Nobody breathed. Rowan's rehearsed welcome died somewhere in his throat, replaced by one useless thought circling without landing anywhere. The King of the North knew her name, knew her hand, knew her, in a way that had clearly existed for far longer than anyone in that yard had ever been allowed to notice. The ledger, the Thornwood Purchase, a short exchange that had felt, 2 mornings ago, like the end of something. It was beginning to feel, instead, like the very beginning. Celine's carefully practiced curtsy stayed frozen halfway to the ground, every rehearsed tilt of her chin forgotten entirely. Whatever she'd imagined for this morning, it hadn't included discovering that the woman she'd spent 3 months steadily outshining had a king's mouth pressed to her knuckles. She looked to Rowan, waiting for him to explain it, to fix it, to do anything at all. He was staring at Evelyn's hand in the king's, like a man watching a wall he'd built collapse in slow motion. He had no explanation to offer. For perhaps the first time since she'd arrived at Iron Ridge, neither did she. Near the front, the old treasurer went very still, several old suspicions rearranging themselves into a single obvious shape at once. Somewhere behind him, a council member Evelyn had once trained whispered something to his neighbor, who whispered it to the person beside him, and within seconds, the entire crowd had become a single held breath, waiting for someone braver than the rest of them to ask the obvious question aloud. Evelyn only looked at Lucien, entirely unbothered by several hundred witnesses, and answered him as though they were alone. You always did have terrible timing. It wasn't an answer to his question. It didn't need to be one. Something in Lucien's expression eased, just slightly. The careful control of a king who'd spent the better part of a year rehearsing patience finally allowed a moment to simply enjoy having found her. Rowan finally found his voice. Your Majesty, forgive me, but, you know Lady Ashford. Lucien didn't look at him when he answered. He didn't look away from Evelyn at all. Know her, he repeated, something close to amusement in it. Alpha Blackthorn. I'd sit down, if I were you, for what comes next. Behind him, 300 people who had spent a fortnight preparing for a political inspection were slowly beginning to understand they'd been preparing for the wrong thing entirely. Lucien didn't wait for the welcome banquet to start asking questions. Within the hour of his arrival, he'd requested every council record Iron Ridge possessed. 4 years of ledgers, trade reports, treaty correspondence, military recommendations. Servants came and went past midnight, arms full of documents no one had thought to organize in years. Each one added to a stack that kept growing long after anyone expected the king himself to still be awake reading them, alone, at the same table where Evelyn had once taught Celine to read a tariff schedule. One report, 3 years old, described how a war with a neighboring pack over disputed grazing land had been talked down before a single wolf drew blood. The same story Rowan still told at dinner, casting himself as the reasonable voice that had ended it. Lucien read the signature twice. The reasonable voice, as it turned out, had belonged to someone else in the room that day. By morning, he understood exactly what Rowan had only begun to suspect days earlier. The handwriting behind nearly everything that had kept Iron Ridge fed, solvent, and at peace for 4 straight years, belonged to one woman, and it wasn't the one wearing the Alpha's favor. The banquet Rowan had spent a fortnight preparing became, without his ever agreeing to it, the venue for something else entirely. The hall was full again that evening. The same crystal chandeliers overhead, new banners hung for a different occasion entirely, nearly the same faces that had gathered months earlier to watch Evelyn smile through her own humiliation. This time they had come to honor a king. Lucien let them settle into their seats, let the first course arrive and disappear, and only then rose from the head of the table. Before we continue, he said, and the hall quieted the way rooms quiet for kings, I'd like to correct something. Iron Ridge appears to have misunderstood for the better part of a year. He looked at Evelyn. She rose without being asked, because she had known, from the moment he'd requested the ledgers, exactly what was coming. Months of watching Iron Ridge slowly forget how to function without her. 4 years before that, of being quietly essential and quietly unacknowledged in the same breath. She stood anyway, back straight, exactly the way she'd stood through every council meeting Celine had sat through, instead of her. Your collar, if you don't mind. She didn't hesitate. She drew it back herself, calm as she'd been the night Rowan named another woman his companion, and let the silver mark beneath her collarbone catch the candlelight for every noble in the room to see. A gasp moved through the hall like wind through dry grass. Near the back, the old treasurer went very still, the last piece of something he'd suspected for months finally settling into place. The royal priestess, who had traveled with Lucien's retinue, stepped forward, unprompted, and confirmed what her presence alone had already half announced. The bond was sealed at the royal summit, she said plainly, without embellishment, the way priestesses said things that were simply, permanently true. 6 months before this hall, watched its alpha choose another woman's company over hers. 6 months. Rowan did the arithmetic in front of everyone, his face changing as it landed. You believed she was merely your administrator, Lucien said, and though he spoke to the whole hall, his eyes stayed on Rowan alone. She has long been my queen. The hall didn't just erupt. It fractured. 100 private conversations breaking out at once, nobles half rising from their seats, a dropped wineglass shattering somewhere unnoticed on the floor. Someone near the doors was already halfway to composing the message that would reach 3 neighboring packs by dawn. Rowan sat perfectly still in the middle of it, watching a woman he'd humiliated in this exact room discover, in front of everyone who'd watched him do it, that she'd been royalty the entire time he'd been deciding she wasn't worth a title. He would spend the rest of that night, and likely several after it, working out what to do with the fact that he'd spent 4 years looking directly at the answer and calling it an assistant. Celine didn't move. Her hand found the back of her chair and gripped it, the only outward sign that the ground had genuinely moved beneath her. Whatever she'd told herself these past months, that she'd earned her place, that time and effort would eventually close the distance between herself and the woman she'd replaced, dissolved in the single sentence it took to learn there had never been a distance to close. She hadn't been competing with Ironridge's quiet administrator. She'd been standing, unknowingly, in a queen's shadow the entire time, certain it was simply the room being poorly lit. Evelyn let her collar fall back into place, unhurried, and looked out at a hall that had spent 4 years underestimating her and 3 months pitying her. She didn't smirk this time either. She simply let them look, and let the silence do whatever it needed to do to the people who'd earned it. Rowan came to her the next morning, before the hall had finished buzzing, without an entourage, and without his usual confidence either. "I'm not apologizing because I lost you," he said, which was, at least, an honest place to start. "I keep expecting to feel that loss more than I do, and I don't, and that told me something on its own. I'm apologizing because I finally read 4 years of my own kingdom's history and found your name on nearly all of it, and mine on almost none. You should have looked sooner. I know." She let the silence sit for a moment, the way she let most things sit, before deciding what to do with them. "I forgive you, Rowan. I mean that." A pause. "I'm still not coming back." He nodded, like a man who'd already known the answer and had simply needed to hear it said plainly, once, by her. It cost her something to say it kindly. She said it kindly anyway. 4 years had taught her that grace wasn't the same as forgetting, and she intended to remember every one of them, warmly, from a comfortable distance. Lucien, for his part, offered Ironridge something Rowan clearly hadn't braced for. Not punishment, but help. Royal advisors on loan to steady the treasury through winter. A trade agreement, generous enough that the neighboring packs stopped asking their careful questions almost overnight. Rowan never fully understood why the king chose mercy over triumph. He suspected, though he never said it aloud, that it had something to do with the woman standing quietly beside Lucien through every negotiation, offering counsel he never once needed to be told twice. Punishing him teaches Ironridge nothing it doesn't already know, Lucien told her when she asked. Helping him teaches every alpha in the north what happens to a kingdom that learns to value the right things too late. Within the month, the old treasurer requested a transfer to the royal court, muttering something about being too old to train a 4th replacement. 2 council members went with him. Celine left before the season turned, taking little more than what she'd arrived with. She asked Evelyn for nothing before she went. No explanation, no absolution, though she left a short, unsigned note that read only, "I understand now." It was, as far as Evelyn was concerned, the most honest thing Celine had ever put in writing. Someone mentioned, much later, that she'd settled with a smaller pack in the west, and had started asking her advisors questions before deciding she already knew the answers. Months later, the great hall of the royal capital, filled with nobles. Silver banners hung beside gold ones, catching candlelight the way they once had at Iron Ridge, though everything here was built on a grander scale. Taller ceilings, older stone, a hall that had clearly hosted centuries of exactly this kind of gathering. The kingdom around it now carried Evelyn's handwriting the way Iron Ridge once had. Treasuries balanced, treaties renewed, a court running with the quiet precision of someone who had never needed applause to keep working. Every alpha in the realm had gathered to watch, not because they expected her to break, because they had heard, by now, exactly what happened to people who underestimated her, and had come to see for themselves the woman who'd turned her own kingdom's worst night into the opening chapter of something else entirely. Lucien lifted the crown before the assembled hall, his silver eyes steady on hers the way they had been since the first moment in that library. "Evelyn Ashford," he said, "Iron Ridge's quiet administrator, far longer than anyone gave her credit for, and mine, whether the world knew it or not, since a night beneath the moon shrine." He set the crown gently upon her head. Let the North remember exactly what it very nearly lost. Their eyes met and held, quiet joy passing between them, without a single word needed to carry it. Somewhere behind her, she was fairly certain, a hawk sat forgotten on a windowsill, with nothing left to deliver. Across the hall, Rowan bowed, not to the woman he'd once overlooked in his own council chamber, to the queen he had come, slowly and honestly, to respect. Evelyn smiled, not the smirk that had once confused an entire hall, and not triumph over anyone who'd wronged her, something quieter than either. Gratitude mostly, that she had waited for a life where she was chosen, rather than merely useful, cherished, rather than merely convenient, seen, rather than simply relied upon. The hall was full again, nobles filling it from the dais to the doors, exactly as they had the night everyone expected her to shatter. This time, they had gathered to watch her rise into a future she had finally, entirely, chosen for herself. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.